Right, we will begin now. A very good afternoon to our audience from warm and humid Singapore. And welcome to today's online event hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Clemens Che, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar entitled China's Political Entanglements in the Middle East, Escaping Inevitability. This is a timely topic considering the Chinese Foreign Minister's six-country tour of the Middle East, which looks set to be concluded just about now, following a very hyped China-Iran deal and also the announcement of a regional production hub in the UAE for the Sinopharm COVID-19 vaccine. China's bilateral relationship in the Middle East has evolved into comprehensive strategic partnerships beyond its economic footprint in the region. The long-standing Chinese vision, often understood through the Belt and Road Initiative or the BRI, has also been revitalized with a new vision 2035. Today, we have with us a fantastic lineup of experts who will address China's quest to become a tech power, how and whether Beijing will be caught up in political entanglements in the region, the US-China strategic rivalry, among other salient topics. So before I begin introducing our speakers, please allow me to run through the sequence of proceedings. We do have 4 speakers on board, and each of them will give an 8 to 10 minute presentation, following which we will have the Q&A segment. Members of the audience are of course welcome to ask their questions via 2 methods. First, by typing in the Q&A chat box on Zoom, or second, to use the raise hand function on Zoom, and we'll proceed to unmute you so you may ask your question. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. First off, we have Dr. Guy Burton, who is an adjunct professor at the Brussels School of Governance and also a fellow on the Sectarianism, Proxies and Desectarianization project at Lancaster University. His research interests deal with the politics and international relations of the Middle East, with a particular focus on the role of rising powers. He is also the author of China and Middle East Conflicts under Routledge and released just last year, and also the author of Rising Powers and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since 1947. Also, a warm welcome to Dr. Zhang Chuzhu, an associate professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs, Fudan University, China. She received her PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, and her research focuses on Middle Eastern politics, China-Middle Eastern relations, and China's foreign policy. She's the author of Islamist Party Mobilization, Tunisia's Ennahda and Algeria's HMS Compared, 1989 to 2014. Also joining us today as a speaker is my colleague, Dr. Alessandro Agrino, the Principal Research Fellow at MEI-NUS. He is the co-director of the Security and Crisis Management International Center at the Shanghai Academy of Social Science and an external associate at Lao China Institute, King's College London. He has 2 decades of experience in China, encompassing security analysis and crisis management. Last but not least, we also welcome Dr. Tugru Keskin, who is professor and director of the Center for Global Governance at Shanghai University. Professor Keskin has taught in Turkey and a number of American universities. His research and teaching interests include international and global studies, social and political theory, African society and politics, sociology of human rights, and sociology of the Middle East. So without further ado, now that I've done all the introductions prim and proper, let us now get into the central topic at hand. Our first presenter for today is Dr. Guy Burton. And Guy, in your recently released China and Middle East Conflicts book, you wrote that the Middle East is a test bed for Chinese foreign policy. And elsewhere, you also wrote that China in the region, its role has been threefold: supporter, shirker, and spoiler. You also pointed to an increasingly multipolar and competitive nature of the region's international system. So as such, besides using the historical context to give us a complete picture, Could you explain China's role in the region according to the geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East? And if you could also kindly outline in your presentation the whole concept of peace through development that China has adopted, where you could actually present an alternative model to the West. So Guy, the stage is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Clemens, and also thank you very much to the Middle East Institute at NUS for inviting me to participate in this. This is wonderful. And you know, in the 8 minutes that I have, I mean, if I just give a very sweeping, you know, sort of survey of China and the Middle East, because I'm sure, you know, my colleagues are going to drill down into a much more, you know, detailed account of some of the specifics. I mean, to start with, you know, I want to sort of provide some historical context to China and the Middle East to understand where we are today. Much of the focus has been, there's been a great deal of interest and focus on China and the Middle East in the past few years, especially in the context of its rising power and also the Belt and Road. But the key thing I want to say is that, number one, you know, China is not a new actor to the Middle East. It has a history that goes back to the 1950s, but the relationship has changed. And number two, it's also very important, you know, for those who live in the Middle East, those of us who study the Middle East, who make the Middle East our focus of work, you know, that we don't overstate things. You know, the Middle East is important, but as far as China is concerned, it is still a secondary, you know, area of concern. You know, once you factor in things like, you know, the mainland, the periphery around China, sort of Taiwan, Xinjiang, the near neighborhood, you know, Middle East still comes further down the list. And so we've got to see that in the context of China's, you know, wider, you know, global ambitions. So, you know, to talk about, just to provide a quick overview of China, how we've reached the point of China today. China has had a history in the Middle East that dates back to the 1950s, you know, during the course of the Cold War, in which it was in competition, not just with the United States, but also with the Soviet Union. And it was the junior partner to the Soviet Union. So in that sense, it was competing with the Soviets for influence, especially amongst some of the more radical nationalist regimes, such as Gamal Nasser in Egypt. But because it wasn't able to have the same kind of military heft, diplomatic weight that the Soviets had, it also had to reach out to significant non-state actors, like the Algerian Liberation Nationalist Movement, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, you know, the Eritrean nationalists, and in the Gut and in the Arabian Peninsula, the Dhafari independence movement as well. And so it was very active in supporting these insurgent groups and providing, you know, not substantial, but some degree of financial and military support in order for them to advance their goals, and providing some political support as well. Things start to change from the early 1970s. I think there is a certain degree of changes happening both within China as well as, you know, in the Middle East. Within China, of course, there is the ending of the Cultural Revolution, of the ideological polarization that has happened, the Mao's slow moving off the stage. And also within, you know, the Middle East and the wider global politics, there is the, you know, a rapprochement between the United States and China. So you see a shift. Whereas before, China's relationship towards the Middle East was primarily driven by politics and ideology, from the 1970s and into the 80s, it becomes more economic and diplomatic. It starts to build relations with, you know, the individual states in the region. And from the 1980s, and especially from 1993, once it becomes an oil importer, a net oil importer, you know, the region becomes a significant economic space. At that point, you know, stability becomes much more important than, you know, becoming a challenger, which refers back to the point that Clemens asked in the opening questions about this idea of supporters, shirkers, and spoilers when it comes to you know, rising powers relationships towards the Middle East. What you have is China being a bit of a spoiler in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, and shifting towards a role that is, I would say, supportive of stability, but shirking from providing any kind of you know, security support for that. So what you see, especially after the Cold War and in the American unipolar moment, obviously the high point of, you know, American hubris is the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and yet, you know, America is unable to ensure a successful occupation on its terms. But what is interesting is a lot of the business contracts that were signed with the Chinese. Now, the Chinese benefited from those economic exchanges without necessarily having to do much of the heavy lifting when it came to security, which prompted Obama in around 2014, 2015 to call China a free rider. So that role of being a shirker, and that is very much the relationship the position that China has had until recently. Even as its rise has in the last, I would say, in the course of the Xi Jinping government since 2012, we are in the period of the Belt and Road Initiative, which was given notice in 2013. And there we have China very much emphasizing economic exchange, economic cooperation, emphasizing the fact that its primary concern is working with these states. Therefore, it can bridge the gap between the divisions that exist within. Again, referring to Clement's question about multipolar competition, if you think about Saudi Arabia and Iran as a major rivalry within the region, China is able to bridge that gap by saying it will work with the Saudis, it will work with the Iranians, but on economic issues. That may well be coming to an end. Belt and Road, has been presented as a win-win, mutually beneficial project. But I think given the fact that it has finite resources and given the fact that it's certain countries that are benefiting more than others, i.e. the stable ones, this is going to create competition. So in a way, China's own project may fuel competition. And we are starting to see Chinese officials talking about what can China do, now that it is no longer just a rising power, but a risen power really in the Middle East. What can it do to counter a lot of the conflicts that is taking place there? And this is where the concept of peace through development has started to emerge. The idea that Belt and Road can contribute towards this effort. The idea being that the way that Beijing sees it, the conflicts are primarily driven through inequality, a lack of sufficient development, and Belt and Road with its infrastructure projects, its connectivity, can help encourage development within local communities, within societies, and therefore overcome any divisions that exist. In some respects, this is an echo of China's own development model post-1978. Although the Chinese often emphasize the fact that China is not, that no country should try and model itself exactly on China, you can draw the lessons and experience from that. So I think those, I'm coming up to my last minute. So I guess the main point is to just say this, that China is currently at a state of possible transition in terms of its role in the Middle East, and I think this is something we're going to talk about in a bit more detail. It is now shifting away from having shirked, having avoided any kind of involvement in terms of security provisions, security guarantees, focusing on economics. That may well be starting to change. But the final point that I must stress, and this is why we often talk about China as a new actor. It is not a new actor. It's just that its roles have changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy, for your most insightful presentation. I guess we have to hold our questions for now as we proceed to the next speaker, Dr. Zhang Chu. Chu, in some of your works, you identified how Beijing has its role adjusted in its foreign policy, from a low-profile stance, commonly known as Tao Guang Yang Hui, to a more proactive posture, also known as Fen Fa You Wei, or to forge ahead, strive ahead. Could you tell us more about the evolving Chinese official narrative towards the Middle East, and has this been translated into reality and genuine action on the ground? And if so, to what degree? Chu, all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Clemens, and thank you so much for organizing this event. From my own perspective, in order to observe China's role in the Middle East, I think, first of all, it is important to understand at least 2 points. So the first point is how China views the role of the Middle East in China's diplomatic strategies. And the second is how China perceives its own role in the region of the Middle East. Well, in recent years, many observers are talking about China's growing presence in the Middle East and are worried about its ambition to probably become a competitor of the United States in the region, or even become a new hegemon in the region. However, if you search the keywords like China's presence in Africa, or China's presence in Latin America, or in South Asia, in Eastern Europe, etc. In Google, you will find many similar articles, because China today has already become a big power in the world, and also it has proposed the Belt and Road Initiative. So for many observers, it seems that China's presence is growing in every corner of the world. But this is not necessarily true. If you look at what has exactly happened in the Middle East, you will find that although China's presence there is somehow evolving, its economic interactions with the Maghreb region, for instance, are by no means comparable to France. And also, China's interactions with the Gulf countries are not comparable to the United States. So China's limited emphasis on the region and its limited influence in the region is at least due to two reasons. First, as many scholars have noted, the Middle East's rank in China's diplomatic priority is not very high. Although many foreign media describe China as a global power, and even some Chinese people acknowledge that, actually China is more of an inward-looking country and pays more attention to its domestic politics than international politics. While China has core interests in its neighboring countries, as there are territorial disputes, and also the neighboring countries can have an impact on the Chinese residents living at the border. So China pays much attention to the neighboring countries. And actually, as you may know, the Belt and Road Initiative, although today it becomes a global initiative, but at first it was proposed as an initiative that is going to deal with the relations between China and its neighboring countries. Also, China pays much attention to big power relations, including its relations with the United States, the EU countries, and Russia. But in the Middle East, China does not have many core interests. So as China has too many things to worry about, it cannot pay too much attention to the Middle Eastern affairs. Well, the second reason why China has limited influence and attention to the region of the Middle East is that many areas in the Middle East are characterized by high political risks. So China advances with great caution and hesitance in significant increase of investment in the region. So it's always cautious and hesitant. And then the next question is how China views its own role in the Middle East. So what does it itself expect that it's going to do in the region? Well, according to my own research, there has been a change, but it is not that China used to adopt the economic diplomacy and now it has become a geopolitical player, as many observers point out. Well, actually, when China carried out the policy of the reform and opening up in late 1970s, China started to adopt the economic policy towards the Middle East, which generally means to do business with every Middle Eastern country, and meanwhile avoiding getting involved in the region's conflicts, just as what Guy has mentioned. Well, as a result of this non-interference policy, China successfully becomes the only big power that is a friend to every country in this region. However, after implementing the economic diplomacy for decades, China suffered from two challenges. First, China has been criticized as a free rider in the region, and many foreign observers or commentators label China as an irresponsible power, which does not care about what's going on in the region. And second, China faces huge losses when regional conflicts arise and affect China's investment and construction projects there. So for instance, after the Arab Spring erupted in 2011, China faces huge losses, first in Libya and then in Yemen. And in this context, more and more diplomats and the intellectuals realize that a side effect of avoiding entanglement in the region's conflict is that when the conflict takes place, you can do nothing. you may not even have a clue of what's going on, and you are totally excluded from the post-conflict negotiation. And in the end, you can't even protect your own economic interests. So currently, China's role and policy in the region is changing. A lot of people in China realize that non-interference does not mean doing nothing. And many people suggest that China needs to take a more proactive policy. However, the problem is how to take a more proactive policy and what does being proactive means. So on the one hand, China does not want to abandon the benefits it gained from the zero enemy policy. It hopes to maintain its friendship with every Middle Eastern country. But if you increase the political presence in the region, it's very likely that you may take sides in the end. And on the other hand, a challenge for China today when dealing with the Middle East is that if it stays away from the conflicts, from the region's political issues, it will be criticized as a free rider. But if it increases its political presence, then it will be criticized as a power which is going to compete with the United States or replace it as a new dominator or a hegemon in the region. So now China has a strategy completely different from the United States. Instead of making allies with certain countries or supporting proxies in the region, it believes that neither foreign intervention nor democracy can really solve the problems of the region. While there is already too much rather than too little intervention in the region, political and military intervention only make things more difficult and complicated. Also, democracy does not really help improve anything, at least in many intellectuals' eyes. There was the Arab Spring in 2011. It was about democracy, but now it becomes an Arab winter. So from China's perspective, conflicts in the Middle East do not result from a lack of foreign interference, but result from the region's development issues. However, no big power seems to really care about the development issues in the region. So why don't we take a different approach? Why don't we help the region with its economic growth? Why don't we develop together? At least everybody wants to develop and want to have economic growth. So for now, just forget about the sectarian disputes. Well, in this way, each Middle Eastern country can have more revenues and the people will have jobs, and China can also get economic benefits from it. So for many intellectuals in China, it seems to be a win-win prospect. Well, based on this analysis, my research shows that for now, China will continue to adopt the economic diplomacy in the region. And in the short term, it doesn't want or it has no plan to take a security role in the region. But it will implement the economic diplomacy in a more proactive manner. And what does being proactive mean? It means that China is going to provide more aid packages to the region, and like what it has done in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, it has provided a lot of health aid packages to the region. And also, for many decision makers' perspective, the Sino-Middle Eastern relations are not just about doing business today, but about developing together. So China may assume its responsibility by paying more attention to the development issues, to invest in the investment development, and to also to increase its investment in the digital development or in the digital technology in the region, and also to help create more jobs there. And it hopes that the economic development in the region can finally help reduce the instability in the region and also help to reduce the political risks for China's companies in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Chu, for clarifying, giving us an insightful account of China's priorities and its strategies and the nuances in its foreign policy. What was also interesting in some of your work is that you noted that China has 21 levels of bilateral diplomatic relations, of which Middle Eastern countries fared pretty well. Turkey in 4th place, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE sharing 5th place, Qatar, Sudan, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, and Iraq in the 7th place. And for our audience's information, Singapore ranks 10th on this bilateral diplomatic relations ranking list. So this brings us to the presentation of our third speaker, my colleague, Dr. Alessandro Arduino, who will bring us, take a step forward to discuss the digital Silk Road and how it is distinguished from the Belt and Road Initiative. At the core of this discussion is, of course, the idea that there is a bifurcation in the realm of information and security technology systems, or a line dividing US allied liberal democracies and others who depend on Chinese ICT, information communication technology. So my colleague Alex will be covering the realm of technology. Alex, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Basically, as my distinguished colleague already mentioned, I want to start with to take out one from Guy, that China is not a new actor in the Middle East, and this also applies to the digital Silk Road. And another takeout from Chu, that China is cautious in the Middle East, but in the realm of digital ecosystem is definitely more assertive. First question is, what is the digital Silk Road? If we look at the digital Silk Road, mainly in the common perception is just the 5G part of the Belt and Road Initiative, is an appendix of the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's not the case. Again, DSR or digital Silk Road is an all-encompassing label, but differ in some respect from the Belt and Road Initiative. It overlaps, but is have a different outreach, and especially in the Middle East. And this today's presentation, I would like to look at two specific cases. One, interaction of the digital Silk Road with Israel, and one with the UAE. Again, digital Silk Road is not only 5G. All the focus mainly, and especially in the Middle East, is related to the US-China competition for ICT supremacy, and if a country is going to align on the side of Huawei or not. As Clemens mentioned in the beginning of the introduction of my presentation, what is the worst outcome that can come out in the Middle East and also in the rest of the world for a technological confrontation between the US and China? And it will be a split in two of the supply chain, of the microchip logistic chain, of the rare earth, but most important, at the coupling of the digital ecosystem. Hopefully, it's not going to happen, but countries in the Middle East already started to try to balance the economic, financial, and trade needs in the digital realm with the national security one. And there are already different outcomes if we look, for example, at Israel, or if we look at the Emirates, or just a few days ago, if we look at the background of Minister Wang Yi visit in Saudi Arabia, it was in the futuristic city of Neom, in which the kingdom is going to invest the staggering amount of 500 billion to develop a new diversified business model in what is called a cognitive futuristic city. COVID-19 has increased the necessity of from the digital realm, from telemedicine to e-learning, and this accelerates several processes that were already ongoing, especially in the GCC country. The trend in moving from hydrocarbon rentier economy to new economy was already there, but COVID-19 ignited it, and Chinese digital Silk Road is an important present inside the development of the economy of this country. But again, what is the digital Silk Road? It's not only 5G. The term digital Silk Road is quite new compared to the Belt and Road Initiative. We see it appear in 2015 in the document, in the vision of the Belt and Road Initiative, just as an information Silk Road. But the real label, encompassing label of digital Silk Road start to appear in 2017 in the International Conference of Wuzhen, in which 8 countries, including the Emirates, sign an MOU in develop with China research on advanced technology, including AI, quantum computing, GPS positioning system, satellite, and so on. And this trend has seen an increased presence of digital technology from China in the Middle East. One of the different between the digital Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative is that the Belt and Road is still carried on by state-owned enterprises, while the digital Silk Road is more on the hand and also on the financial hand of the private sector. Of course, if we want to talk about the difference between private sector in the US and in China, we need another conference just for this. But having said that, there are companies that are spearheading the digital Silk Road, Huawei, ZTE, Xiaomi, Tencent, that already have a quite deep inroad in the GCC. As I mentioned before, the relationship with Israel is another story. It's a relationship in which China is not trying only to sell its own technology, but is trying to acquire Israeli technology. Israel, who is considered the startup nation, has increased the partnership in terms of venture capital with the Chinese side, but still US venture capital in Israel, it's at very high level of investment. And we don't have to forget that since the 2000, the Israel defensive system has been trying to constrain any kind of military transfer, high technological transfer to China, especially the one related to dual use certification. On this respect, as I mentioned before, digital Silk Road essentially is not only 5G, but it can be divided basically in 4 pillars. And we can see these 4 pillars along the Middle East, from the GCC and even to the broader area in the MENA region. First pillar is infrastructure. Of course, 5 and 6G is an important part, but it's also cable, fiber optic cable, connecting big data, underwater cable, satellite cable. Beidou, the satellite system from China, the GPS part is fully operational. And then a second part, moving from infrastructure, is the so-called e-pillars. And by pillars, I mean e-governance, e-commerce, and especially fintech. And this is quite important for countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or UAE that aim to be the core or the fintech revolution in the Middle East. Last but not least is the development of a smart city, Internet of Things, and big data computation and analytical center. Again, the competition is direct with US investment, but also in the realm of telecommunication, we already witnessed a diversification with, for example, the UAE trying to edge between putting all the egg in one basket with China and giving space to other players. So Huawei is one of the main players, but also Nokia and Ericsson, for example, are important developers of the ICT infrastructure in the UAE. Also the security implication. Cybersecurity, control of the local population, visual face recognition is an important part of the technology transfer from China to the Middle East, including Israel. Companies that are not well known, like Huawei, for example, but like the company in Hangzhou, like Hikvision, are the world leading in closed circuit camera with automatic visual recognition. And these play quite an important part in the security structure of each country. So to summarize my take on the digital Silk Road is the digital competition with the US is already putting several constraints in Gulf country and in all the Middle East in making a choice in being with China or without China. Of course, it creates problem in the business sector, as most of the business are looking at Chinese component as widely available and at a very competitive price, while the national security part of each country is looking at the security implication that carry on having Chinese equipment inside the country and how it is going to play with the United States. Worst case scenario is a complete split up in 2 of the digital ecosystem. And on this, I just would like to conclude my brief presentation quoting Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, that mentioned just a few months ago that bifurcation in technology bifurcation in market, and bifurcation is trust, is a very bad outcome for all the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to my colleague Alex for providing the finer details of the digital Silk Road. And it remains to be seen whether China will keep up with the trend of a fourth industrial revolution. So now we move on to our final presentation by Professor Tugru Keskin. Professor Keskin would like to shed light on the relations between Turkey and China, given your expertise, and also talk a bit about the degree of competition or cooperation between the two sides. In the Chinese foreign minister's recent visit to Ankara, there was much praise lavished on the Chinese vaccine. But earlier this month as well, President Erdogan has also announced a human rights action plan. So in your opinion, what lies ahead for Turkey-China relations? Professor Keskin, is yours. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, Sino-Turkish relations is a little bit different than the other countries in the region. Probably similar to Israel, from my understanding at least. Sino-Turkey relations occupy a critical juncture in China's push in the Middle East. Let's not forget this. And in Turkey's evolving foreign policy under the Erdogan government and JDP, despite the geographical and cultural distance between them, Turkey's geostrategic placement, regional influence, and regionally strong economy are attractive to China, actually. From the Turkish perspective, a closer relationship with China represents a path to diversification away from the reliance upon Western countries, particularly considering its own strained relation with the European Union and NATO, actually. This is a multifaceted and complicated relationship between China and Turkey, as well as the Turkey and NATO and the United States. Since October 2010, the two partners have defined their bilateral ties as a strategic cooperative relationship. Although cooperation between the two does exist, it is questionable as whether it rises to strategic level. Problems persist where national interests on both sides collide actually. During this tenure as Foreign Minister Davutoğlu, the previous one basically under the the AKP government, now he formed a different party today. He is challenging the JDP government and aspired to develop democracy with the European Union standard and production style with the Chinese standards. Within the vein of the China model or Beijing consensus, Turkey views China as both a partner and an example of the development to be emulated. And particularly after the Eurozone crisis, and integrating with Europe has become less attractive than that of China, to say nothing to traumatic experience of the Turkey's own bid to join the EU actually. But on the popular level, however, Turks hold a negative perception of China. Let's not forget. Also, we have a negative perception of the United States as well. We have the highest negative perception of the United States after Palestine in the world. In 2017 Pew poll, 54% of the Turks expressed an unfavorable view of China, a measure of the disapproval that has not descended below 50% since 2006 actually. What fostered this states when the Turkish elites appear so keen to improve the relationship actually. So, important issue between Turkey and China, Uyghur issue actually. Xinjiang issue. Public attitudes in Turkey hinge about the Uyghurs due to close ethnic and linguistic ties between Turks and Uyghurs. This emerged as a contentious issue for the Sino-Turkish relations under the circumstances, especially between US and China Cold War. And Turkish relations since the radical Islamic groups emerged in Central Asia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The increasing radicalization and Salafization of the Chinese Muslim communities has generated communal unrest within China. On the other hand, since the Justice and Development Party came to power in early 2000, Turkey has played an active role in championing the Muslim rights externally. This approach, given the anti-sovereignty discourse, engenders the Chinese suspicions actually on this subject. Let's not forget, Turkey officially supported the Uyghur separatist movement until the Bülent Ecevit government prohibited their operations in 1998 to improve the Sino-Turkish relations. And let's not forget, this year is the 50th anniversary of the recognition of the China and Turkey to each other in 50 years. And yet, when unrest in Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang, emerged in 2009, Prime Minister Erdogan, current president basically, termed the incident as almost genocide. The Turkish government, however, took no steps to demote relations. Rhetoric with no actions has become paradigmatic as to how the Turkish government handles the Uyghur issue vis-a-vis with China. The Chinese government, in turn, did not react to rhetoric from Ankara. The Turkish government had to react to domestic sentiments, but neither side saw the break in the relations over this issue, basically. This is a very important issue, basically, is like the elephant in the room between China and Turkey's relations. Also, the China's relation with the Middle Eastern and Muslim populated countries as well. While Beijing concern regarding Turkey's position on the Chinese territorial integrity have been alleviated, the problem of the Uyghur immigrants to Turkey remains contentious. China has actively sought the return of many of them as primary destination with the massive Turkish public support to their asylum. Turkey and China will not find a common ground. In 2015, Beijing alleged Turkey having an active role in assisting the illegal immigration of Uyghurs from China. The Chinese government originally kept the communication with the Turkey over this issue private in an attempt to avoid damaging relations, a sign of how important the bilateral relationship has become actually. Though sympathy for the Uyghurs permeates the Turkish political landscape, different political parties prioritize the issue differently. With its pan-Turkic sentiment, the Nationalist Movement Party holds xenophobic views after negative media reports about the Uyghurs in China in 2015. MHP members attack the Chinese properties and tourists in Turkey. With the AKP need to maintain good relation with China and the MHP critical attitude being part of the same government after the 2018 elections. The result, foreign policy is amalgamation that pleases no one actually. This became apparent in February 2019 when the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in February, they announced the policy of the systematic assimilation of the Uyghurs after contradictory reports of the death of a famous Uyghur singer poet. This was a very important poet basically in China and as well as in Turkey. But this was a fake news actually. Therefore, I think Turkish official and Turkish public should pay attention to Radio Free Asia's mispropaganda basically. Taking place very close to March local election, the statement catered to domestic audiences but sparked a fierce response from the Beijing actually. Let's not forget. And although there was no concrete follow-up, over the last few years, the Turkish approach to Uyghur issue is restrained. They refrain from the supporting separatist ideologies, but advocate for the Uyghur rights within the framework of the People's Republic of China. This stance can be characterized as a quasi-critical engagement, permitting the Turkish politician to cater to both their domestic and constituents as well as maintaining positive relation with China, actually. Given Turkey's NATO membership, developing extensive military ties to China presents substantial risk for the Turkey's traditional defense relationship, frank ties, especially United States, especially with NATO, especially neoconservative elite inside the Beltway, basically, and have prodded Turkey to turn elsewhere for the military supplies to demonstrate its independence. One of them is China, basically. The other one is Russia. Joint military operations to uncommon have taken place in 2010 between China and Turkey. China joined the Anatolian Eagle exercise, a NATO operation alongside Israeli forces. In the middle of the Turkey, Konya is a very religious town, actually. The inclusion of the China symbolizes substantial upgrade in military ties, as well as willingness to back Western demands in the military arena, especially after Turkey prohibited the Israeli participation. Therefore, the signal that Turkey maintains option beyond NATO, actually. Turkey is looking for another partner or another alliance for themselves, basically. Additionally, Turkey has sought an air defense missile system during the past decade. As a NATO member, And let's not forget, Turkey became a NATO member in 1952. Let's not forget, 1952. It was a coincidence actually by the United States. Turkish ambassador in Moscow in late 1940s, they sent a message to the Ankara actually. His name is Selim Sarper. Selim Sarper sent the special note to the Ankara Turkish Foreign Ministry and telling them Soviet Union asking for the northeast part of Turkey and plus Bosphorus and those areas from the government. But this was not true. This has never been proved actually. The same ambassador brought back to Turkey, became the second person of the Turkish foreign ministry. Later, he became ambassador to United Nations and stayed there 10 years. After the US military supported coup in 1960, basically, he became the foreign minister of Turkey, and Turkey joined NATO, basically. It was very interesting, complicated process between Turkey and NATO. And additionally, Turkey sought an air defense missile system during the past decade. As a NATO member, the American Patriot missile system would have been the obvious choice over Russian, Chinese, and European competition. Yet the Turks initially offered a contract, a $3 billion US dollars to a Chinese company for the HQ-9 defense system. This deal arose fierce resistance from the United States, especially the security establishment inside the Beltway and some of the military industrial complex, both on technical grounds, whether or not it could be integrated with the NATO system, and on political grounds, as the Chinese producer was under American sanction for dealing with Iran. So the deal was scrapped in 2015. It still damaged relation with the NATO. Finally, Turkey has been a dialogue partner in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization since 2012, although it has sought higher level of the membership, failed the missile system contract of 2015 while President Xi Jinping was visiting Turkey, remain a potent negative memory and lesson for the Chinese regarding the eventual difficulties to integrate Turkey. Thus, even if the Turks seek to overcome dependence on NATO through the improving military ties with China, the Chinese consider Turkey in NATO ties as a factor that prevents actual military cooperation actually. President Erdogan, 2015 visit to China, cemented that trade is the centerpiece of the relationship as contentious issues were sidelined in favor of the development discussions. Bilateral trade in 2000 only totaled $1 billion and has expanded significantly since. Nonetheless of the plateau has been reached during the past decade. Turkish export to China hovers to around $2.5 billion, and China represents Turkey's single largest source of the imports. On the other hand, bilateral trade peaked in 2013 at $28.29 billion. It has decreased since, but without any sustained drops. Optimistic goals about reaching almost $100 billion by 2025 remain out of reach, basically. The only source of the economic friction remains the gapping trade deficit peaking at the $23 billion USD in 2016. The two economies are structured differently, and imagining Turkish export portfolio that will elevate the deficit is not simple. Turkey exports little of interest to Chinese consumers, investment flows, particularly under the Belt and Road Initiative, an increasing level of tourism, and could reinstate the deficit of the capital and into Turkish economy, basically. China has sought to drive more tourists to Turkey. 2018 was declared as a Turkey tourism year, and the number of the Chinese tourists increased from less than 100,000 in 2011 to 400,000 tourists that year. As an economy heavily reliant on the tourism, this marks an important step in the improvement of the economic ties, also demonstrate how damaging incidents like the MHP attacks on the Chinese tourists or Korean tourists, basically by mistake in 2015. Turkey has also been recipient of the Chinese capital directly. For example, China invested $750 million into Istanbul-Ankara high-speed railway project, which included the transfer of the relevant technology to Turkey. Turkey is actively partnered with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, obtaining almost $1.4 billion investment over the course of 2018. Furthermore, China has directly transferred funds to Turkey under the currency swap agreement, with one taking place around the politically sensitive local elections. This transfer could be interpreted as both a political and economic gesture. In the last, despite desire and efforts to improve relations, structural factors undermine the ability for China and Turkey. Both sides, they don't trust each other for different reasons, or maybe for the same reason. Thus, current relations appear to have a hit plateau of the sports. The Turkish public remains distinctly sympathetic to Uyghur separatists, cause given their extensive linguistic ethnic ties. Chinese conversely consider criticism of what they perceive as a domestic policies as unacceptable. At the same time, military ties have been established, but only in general sense, and Turkey remains a dialogue partner in the SCO. The economic front appears to be most promising, for continued progress. Yet levels of the bilateral trade have not grown substantially in years, despite ambitious goals. The trade relationship is also very balanced. Steps to remedy this have been taken through there is a lot of ground to make up, basically. But from my understanding, both sides, including in this trip, Wang Yi, Foreign Minister Wang Yi's trip and meeting with the President Erdogan and Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, I don't think these trips, has helped Turkey and China relations as much as helped, the Iran and China relations, recent visit to Iran, basically, or other countries, basically. But we will see in the future what will happen. Turkey relations with the West is declining, and as a result of the United States is supporting the Kurdish terrorist movement, creating the terrorist state in Syria, in Iraq. United States in same way supporting the Uyghur separatist movement, divide the China. I think China and Turkey, they can find a common ground from my own observation, beside the economy. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Keskin, for outlining Turkish-China relations. And thank you to all of our speakers for all your respective presentations. We now enter the Q&A segment. We do have a couple of questions coming in, and while our audience is fine-tuning and adjusting their thinking cap, and I would like to remind our audience that you can actually type your questions into the Zoom chat box or raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask your question. So right now we do have a few questions coming in, and the first one is more of an observation. I'm going to tie in with a question that I have as well. So the first comment that we have is from Dr. Zeno Leone, who is based at the King's College London Defence Studies Department. And Dr. Leone says that she was intrigued by Zhang Chuchu's point that China's engagement with the region is uneven or limited. And there's an inference, from this point of view, that in the West, they tend to describe the BRI as if it was such a huge, perfectly calculated, grand strategic plan, which the media also associates with. However, the picture in the comment, as stated in the comment, is more multifaceted than actually carefully calculated. So that's a comment, and I would like to tie this into something more related to the Middle East, the regional dynamics being subsumed under a great power rivalry between the US and China, and how a new Biden administration will actually change things or not. So I would like to invite our speakers to comment on these observations and also to respond to the question. So we'll probably start with our first presenter earlier, Guy. Would you like to unmute yourself to answer these questions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, if I may, just to touch upon Zeno's question there. I mean, I know it's directed to Chuchu, but I think it's worth reiterating that China's presence in the Middle East is it is not a uniform one, and you can see that in the nature of the relationships that it has with individual states. That it has signed comprehensive strategic partnerships, which is kind of the highest form of engagement that it has with, I think, only about 5 countries. So those would be Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Algeria, Egypt, and Tugral will correct me whether it's Turkey or not. But certainly a lot of the Chinese investment, finance, economic activity takes place and is concentrated in the Gulf and also with Israel. But that has meant that other countries like Syria and Libya, these conflict-prone affected countries, have lost out. Although you will notice the efforts of the leaderships to try and sort of emphasize the role of their relationship with the Chinese, that they would like the Chinese to come in and invest as part of reconstruction and rebuilding. And this is very much sort of showing that they have other options. And I think this kind of ties in a little bit with the, a lot of the discussion that's been happening in the last couple of days vis-a-vis Iran, and whether or not there is a $400 billion dollar deal on the table, which seems questionable, but it's very much Iran playing it up to emphasize that it has options if American sanctions continue. So this kind of swiftly brings me into the point that you asked, Clemens, about America's role. I don't think that, yes, maybe America is in decline, but it's not leaving the region. And within the Beltway, within Washington, there is a lot of discussion about can America pivot from the Middle East to the Far East? And if so, does that mean it is ceding the ground to others like Chinese and the Chinese and the Russians? This idea that somehow the American tide goes out and the Chinese tide comes in, I don't think it's as simple and clear cut as that. I mean, we've discussed this in terms of security terms. The Chinese are a bit more ambivalent about taking on the American role. Certainly, but we are seeing the Americans bringing their containment strategy into the Middle East. They have put pressure on the Israelis in terms of their relationship, their economic relationships and contracts, and Alex has alluded to that. And increasingly, we have started to see some of that in the UAE. Whether that is going to actually be viable in the long term is debatable. I mean, certainly some of those in Washington see, the Abraham Accords, for example, the normalization deal between the UAE and Israel as the start of an Arab-Israeli alliance against Iran. And yet there is very much possibility that the Chinese see this, as an opportunity to come in and to work with existing partners, which goes counter to American interests. So really, the Americans have a choice on the table. It's either continue to contain China, which won't necessarily be to its benefit, or it can try and work with it on files where there is mutual interest. They won't agree on everything, but there is an interest, jointly to see greater stability within the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. True, would you like to add on to what Guy has just said, please?
Yeah, thank you, Clemens, and thank you for Dr. Liu's question and comment. Yeah, first of all, just as Dr. Liu's comment, indeed, actually, although a lot of commentators think that China's foreign policy making is somehow like top-down thing, and it's like a well-organized, well-calculated strategy before it was even proposed, but actually it's not necessarily the case. Actually, usually when China, this is how it works when it makes decisions. So for instance, when it proposes a big idea such as the Belt and Road Initiative, first of all, well, the top leadership is going to just propose a broad idea, but without a lot of detailed substance, without a lot of detailed content. And then there is going to be a lot of discussions, debates between the intellectuals, between the government officials, and between different different parties in China. And then it's going to evolve, and it becomes what it's like today. So it's not something like well organized and well calculated at the very beginning. So let's say, let's set an example of the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance. At the very beginning, as I just mentioned, when it was first proposed in 2013, it was actually mainly about the neighboring countries with China, because these are the countries where China has core interests. But in a second step, like when we talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, then it became an initiative which aims to revive the ancient Silk Road. And if you talk about the ancient Silk Road, then it's about Eurasia, right? So in the second step, you will find that in some of China's media, they talk about the 65 countries along the Belt and Road, and they talk a lot about the regions like the Middle East and also about Central Asia, for instance. But then in the third step, things has become to change because a lot of African countries come to China and say, hey, I think we are supposed to be good friends. We are brothers, right? But now you have a grand idea and we are excluded. And China doesn't want to displease anybody. So in the end, in the third step, the Belt and Road Initiative has become and evolved into an initiative that actually includes everybody, includes every corner in the world, and even like African countries, Latin American countries are included, even though they have nothing to do with the ancient so-called. Following along with this line of thinking, actually China's policy towards the Middle East follows the same principle. So it's like China's policy towards the region is also not a uniform one, just like what Guy has mentioned. So it's also, there are also like a lot of nuances, a lot of discussions and debates in China. And the second question, so Clemens has just mentioned about the relations between China and the United States regarding the Middle Eastern issues. Well, I think that first of all, when we talk about China and the United States in the Middle East, we have to acknowledge a fact that is the region of the Middle East today is neither a priority in the diplomatic agenda of the United States, nor is it a priority for China. So the importance of the region for both powers is limited. And as I have just mentioned, China does not have many core interests in the region. So this means that although the tensions between the United States and China are escalating, and China and the United States have a lot of disputes over a lot of issues, the two powers are not likely to have many disputes over the Middle Eastern issues. And that is the least thing that China wants to see. Since it doesn't have many core interests in the region, and we have a lot of disputes with the United States on some very sensitive and more sensitive issues, which is directly related to China's core interests. So why should we have disputes over the Middle East? So, well, of course, if China increases its political and military presence in the region, the United States will become nervous. But this is not what China wants. And currently, actually, I agree with Guy. I think that there actually exists common grounds for China and the United States, as well as the EU countries in the region. So, for instance, how to help the oil countries diversify their economies and how to help the region solve the problem of instability, for instance, rather than to rival over the region's issues and further complicate the region's geopolitics. And so that is why a lot of Chinese intellectuals today, they even suggest that we should find some common grounds in the region with the United States and the EU countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Oh, I just want to make a brief comment to the question of Zeno. Basically, China, and especially in the Middle East, and the recent trip of Minister Wang Yi in the sixth country underlined it, is an investment-centric approach to foreign policy. Therefore, what I like to call, especially in areas that are more sensitive to security issue, for example, like Libya or Syria, China apply also what I like to call a balanced vagueness approach to foreign policy. And that means that with balanced vagueness that policy in one country doesn't jeopardize China policy in another country. So as United States and the overall security architecture in the Middle East is changing, is transitioning and is changing shape, I do believe that while China can have increasing friction with the US all over the world, in the Middle East, there is an overlapping ground for cooperation. And this cooperation is anti-terrorist policy, security policy, where both China and the United States can look at multipolar order in which several countries outside the region can cooperate. And by this country, I mean Turkey, Russia, India, as well as the country inside the Middle East, as no country at regional level can exert its own hegemony. Therefore, there is a need of this balance. Of course, it can seem a little bit naive as a proposition, but again, there is more chance of cooperation in the Middle East than of friction.
Thanks, Alex. Tugru, would you like to add on to what three speakers have already given their 2 cents?
Maybe, maybe I have a slightly different view, I don't think United States and China can cooperate in the Middle East. It's very difficult under the circumstances because of the Middle East is an American backyard, so is Latin America, unlike other countries, other regions in the world. And also, maybe I disagree with my friend, my colleague. I don't think, that China and United States can cooperate on Islamic movements or radicalism, because one side is supporting the radicalism, the other side is trying to stop the radicalism. United States has been supporting the radical Islamic and jihadist movements since the Afghan jihad started, actually, in Afghanistan in 1979, collaboration with Zia ul-Haq in 1979, and execution of the Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. As a result of this, the Islamic movements and radical movements, Al-Qaeda or similar kind of organizations, have been created, not just directly by the United States, but as a result of the United States' unintended consequences in the Afghanistan and Pakistan. United States has been doing the same thing in Syria, basically. Why, the 2,000 to 3,000 Uyghurs have been fighting in Syria or Iraq and in Libya? How they come? What kind of passport they get? What kind of logistic they get? These are the questions that we need to answer. According to the New York Times article in 2013, actually, United States was supporting the paramilitary sports and logistics, the certain groups in Turkey, collaboration with the Turkish government, actually. This was a New York Times article published in New York Times in 2013. So it's very difficult to collaborate on this issue because China has its own interests, trying to protect their own borders and security, fighting against terrorism. On the other hand, United States has been damaged by the terrorism on September 11, but United States has been using these groups and had been involved in this group's activities since the 1970s. They have a very interesting love and hate relationship with these groups. So we need to know this, then, we need to figure out what will happen next. So.
Thank you, Tugru. I think I see a hand from the audience. It's our MEI board member, Sir Anthony Theo. Would you like to turn on your video and unmute yourself to ask your question, please?
Yes, I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Yes. I like the narrative in terms of China's involvement for the last 50 to 70 years. 50 to 70 years. The problem is this. The problem is memory. And memory, for the last 70 years, China was the leader in the non-aligned movement with Colonel Nasser, with Sukarno. And they went to, Zhou Enlai went to Egypt with Nasser, ran up the pyramid, and was brotherhood. And that was after the Bandung Conference. 7 years later, the Chinese and the Indians got into a war. Today, China is bigger, much more influential. So I've got 2 points in here. One is, from a military point of view, there can be collaboration in terms of government and private securities, like in Libya and in Djibouti and elsewhere. The other part has to do with the Belt and Road. So the problem with memory is this. 60, 70 years ago, the Chinese did some wonderful work in Africa, in the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. It was a rather purist form of what a non-aligned country with Africa could work together. Today, the Belt and Road system has many successes, but it is a very capitalist type of model in that some of these have come into grief, like in Equatorial Guinea, Principe, Sri Lanka, and a few others. So we can talk about they have been involved, but we must remember that history and memory is a problem. We cannot just wash it away. Whether it's the Chinese or the Americans, they can't wash it away, except that in the Belt and Road, the Biden administration is beginning to think as to how they could deal with that from a more two-way street. That has still got to be seen. So I like the speakers to comment on it. And in particular, for Professor Chang, because when you are small, it's okay. When you are big, whether you exert the issue of bigness and hegemon exists, and you've got to deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Teo. I think we'll start with Chu.
Okay, thank you for Mr. Teo's question. Yeah, I think he has raised the problem about the memory issue. And he has also mentioned an interesting point, which is a comparison between the railway that we built for the African countries in the 60 or 70 years ago and the Belt and Road Initiative right now. Well, I think that this is a very interesting comparison, and but I think that so there are differences, but there are similarities as well. So the difference is that actually in the 1950s and 1960s, which was the first 2 or 3 decades after China got independence. So China's diplomacy was more like ideological diplomacy. So at that time, yeah, China was very interested in the non-alignment movement. And at the same time, basically there was the context of the Cold War. So at that point, so the main allies or the main diplomatic partners for China was those countries which share the same ideologies with China. But then things has become to change, and after the end of the Cold War, and after China adopted the opening up and reform policy, China started to change its diplomatic ideas, and now it has adopted the economic diplomacy. So right now, China is not just dealing with the countries which share the same ideologies, but at the same time, it also, deal with the countries which have different ideologies from China. And the second difference is that in the past, when China had interactions with the countries in Africa, for instance, at that time, China itself was a backward country and it was a poor country. We didn't have a lot of money. And also China's technology was quite backward as well. And also at that point, China, in the country, we can see that we have our own problems. We have a lot of people who were starving. A lot of people were living below the poverty line. So after decades of development, now China has developed into a big economic power. So today, China thinks that it has to, first of all, summarize its own experience in its own economic development and introduce this kind of experience to the other countries. And also at the same time, it thinks that, so today we care more about the win-win prospect of this kind of projects. So when we deal with, or when we promote the Belt and Road Initiative, like one important purpose is to develop and is to develop together for all of the partners. And also China has to gain economic interest, but the other countries also, they have to gain their interest. It's not that, so like mutual interest is also important. But at the same time, there are also similarities between what China did 60 or 70 years ago and what it does now. So for instance, that is the aid and that is the friendship. So for instance, 60 or 70 years ago, China sent the medical team to countries like Algeria. And today it's doing the same in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think now there are changes, but there are also similarities. Thank you.
Thank you, Chu Chu. Would anyone want to add on to what Chu Chu has said in addition to what she has said in response to Mr. Teo's question?
Yes, if I may, just a couple of remarks. As Dr. Teo underlined very well, around 49, 79, Chinese involvement in the Middle East was driven by an ideological struggle against imperialism, colonialism, and it was in the framework of the Cold War. 79 to 2012, it evolved to a more cautious and let's say selective engagement. And nowadays it looks at development, but not at a democratic peace in the Middle East, more at a developmental peace in the Middle East. From the security point of view, has been mentioned private security and Djibouti. Djibouti is the first military base outside China, and it's quite important for all the equilibrium in the Horn of Africa and for the ongoing anti-piracy operation that the People Liberation Navy is already carrying on. And the private security, it's quite an interesting security actor that it's evolving in China. And it's basically filling partially some of the security gap that the PLA cannot fill up to now. Yes. And basically that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And I hope, Mr. Teo, they've answered the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clement.
Thank you. We'll move on to a few more questions on the chat box. There seems to be a few right now. So in the interest of time, let me try to lump it and point it in the right direction to specific speakers. So we do have, of course, the most popular one, and the hype right now is on the China-Iran deal. And the question really is about, how likely is Iran going to sell discounted oil to China over the next 25 years in exchange for China's investments and political support? Is it a recognition on the Iranian side that it has more to gain from aligning with China than with the US? So I'll leave this question for Chu Chu and Guy. All right. We have another question on arms sales, and I think the perfect candidate is Alex. So the question on arms sales is, China has a long history of arms sales to Iran that seems to have been reinforced by the recent agreement that is reported to include deepening military cooperation, including joint training and exercises, joint research and weapons development and intelligence sharing. Given the current interstate dynamics in the Gulf, would this not amount to interference? This is a question from Philip Andrews Speed. And then we have one more question, and I think I will assign this to Tugru, is on Islam. And the question is, I wonder if you can relate a bit on Chinese involvement in Islam through its involvement in the Hajj and various infrastructural projects in Saudi Arabia, and especially in Mecca. Do you see this as China going global through implicating itself in Islam? And this question comes from Ruslan Yusupov. I think we'll start with Tugru first, from the back, since I just put the question forward. Tugru, please.
Oh, me? No, yeah. I'm not an expert on Saudi Arabia, but the Chinese involvement in Saudi Arabia and the Islam and Middle East, it has been a long the process basically. Also, I would like to mention one more thing with the Theo's comment on imperialism and the African countries and Chou En-lai. I think it's very important that we need to understand Chou En-lai visit in 1963, in 1957, Middle East and African countries. This has been very important visit actually. China today is not the same China. It's bigger China with almost more than 400 million people middle class, 1.4 billion people with the energy needs. China needs energy. China needs the market. China needs natural resources. But so is Europe and the United States in the 18th and 19th century. China has been doing the similar things, but with a different approach. China's relation with Islam is from my own perspective, is different than the other countries. It's different than the other countries. If you look at the Hui or the other Chinese Muslim communities, basically, they have been Muslim and they have been in the Islam, engaging with Islam for over centuries. I mean, one of the first mosques in China was built in 742, basically in Xi'an. There are other mosques around the region. China has been, on the other hand, has been investing and building the mosques in the Middle East. Algerian mosque is I think, one of the third largest mosque in the world. Basically, China is investing, and also the project in Mecca and Riyadh and other places. And China needs to get involved in the Middle East, not just the economy, but also politics. There is no escape from this. Middle East is very slippery road. That United States has been in the Middle East and involving in the internal politics and domestic politics last 60, 70 years. They are not successful. I am not sure China will be successful under the circumstance of the chaotic wars and urbanization and society and politics. If you look at the Syria and Iraq today, is an entire mess, actually, entire mess. And the next step is the Jordan and Lebanon. And Iran, on the other hand, under the sanction of the United States. I mean, entire region has been a mess since the United States involvement or British involvement in the early 1900s, basically. So involving in this mess is not going to be easy for the China. On the other hand, China doesn't have, from my own understanding, doesn't have a lot of the Middle Eastern experts. Middle Eastern experts, unlike the United States. Don't forget, Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., originally supported by the CIA and State Department, established in 1946. Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Middle East Studies Associations, established by the State Department in 1966. There are a lot of scholars, coming from the Europe, British. They adopted the British policies. I mean, Tim Niblock, probably he knows better than me, who is in China now. But China needs to be very careful when they get involved in the Middle East. It's not like the East Asia or Southeast Asia. They know better. Or Africa. There are a lot of African studies center. Middle East is slightly different. Islam is a slightly different issue, and it's a very touchy subject for the China, and as well as for the United States, because United States, don't forget, we should remember, United States has been using the certain Islamic groups against the Soviets in the 1970s, 80s. And similar kind of groups has been used in Afghanistan and Pakistan, like the Uzbekistan Islamic movements, influenced the ETIM, basically, Eastern Turkestan Islamic movements, under the Bahtiyar Namangani. So United States has been involving in this issue for a long time. I am not sure China will be successful, or, we will see. We will see what will happen, basically.
Thank you, to group. Let us move to the China-Iran deal question. Maybe Guy, you'd like to take that on first?
Yeah, thank you, Clemens. I mean, very, very briefly, it's a very good question about sort of China and Iran, and there is a lot of talk about the two of them working together and collaborating and creating this kind of anti-US alliance or partnership. I mean, I think that's overstating it. I mean, if you look at the history of China and Iran's relationship with each other, it is, I mean, currently, I think what's happening is because of Chinese American containment, basically American pressure, both against Iran and China, that is pushing the two of them together. It's not that they necessarily want to be together, although it serves their interests right now to do so. But keep in mind, of course, that, if there was an alternative, they would take it. And if you look at Chinese-Iranian relations, there have been points back in the 1990s, for example, when the Chinese, seeing better relations with America on the table, abandoned Iran and abandoned the nuclear cooperation it was doing at the time. So both of them would be, and you can see this with Iran right now. I mean, Iran wants to see sanctions lifted against it. So it wants investment from the West. So it's not solely looking to the Chinese, it's forced to look to the Chinese. Now, the final point I will say is that both, the relationship is not an equal one. So, it will cost more for Iran to walk away from China than it will for China to walk away from Iran. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Guy. Chu, would you like to add on to what Guy just said?
Yeah, thank you. Basically, I agree with Guy's comments. I have just 3 points very briefly. So first of all, actually, when we talk about the China-Iran deal, we have to bear in mind that it is not something that just emerges immediately, like yesterday it just come out. But no, but actually negotiation between the two sides started long ago. And it's not that the tensions between China and the United States are escalating and then we are going to take an revenge and take a revenge and we just call Iran and we just sign a new agreement. It's not like that. But actually, it has already been a long process. So yeah, and also why is there a deal like that? Actually, China needs Iran's energy, but also Iran, it needs China's investment. It has economic difficulties right now. So as Guy has mentioned, it doesn't have many choices right now. And also we have to bear in mind that it's not the first day that China decides to invest in Iran. Actually, if you look back at the history of Sino-Iranian relations, you will find that the two countries' relations can be dated way back. So it's just continuing what has already happened. It's not something new. And the second point is that if you look at the China-Iran deal, you also have to look at the whole context. So recently, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he not only visited Iran, but also visited Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Bahrain, Oman, which shows that China has no intentions to get entangled in the region's conflicts. And it's not that China is going to take sides between the region's powers and China is going to make an ally with Iran. It's not like that. China only plans to invest in Iran, but at the same time, it also hopes to invest in the other Middle Eastern countries as well. And the third point is that for Iran, just as what Guy has mentioned, it doesn't have many choices right now. It hopes, and because its economy is in such a difficulty, it really wants to have more, investment from the Western countries, but they just refuse to give it. So it has no choice but to look at China. So for Iran right now, China is an alternative, and it's more like a hedging tool, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Chushu, and thank you, Guy, for your input. Alex, do you want to respond to the question on arms sales, please?
Definitely. I will try to be brief. Arms deal, it's a part of military diplomacy. And then we can question for a long time if military diplomacy is going to infringe non-interference. Having said that, again, I want to repeat myself saying that China is not a new actor in the Middle East. What it means, that is not just now that China woke up with the 25 years agreement with Iran, looking at training, weapon development, intelligence sharing, and so on. For example, in the 80s, during Iran-Iraq war, when there were Scud and Pershing missiles moving from one side to the other of the border, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia tried to acquire defense capability in the missile system, and then it was China that gave to the KSA a lifeline with the Dongfeng missile system. If we move in the 90s, then we have the crisis between US and Israel, with Israel trying to sell to China the Falcon system, that it was an airborne early warning system. And this problem show up again in Israel, if I recall correctly, in 2005 with the loitering munition, the Harpoy system, that again the United States blocked the transfer to China. So weapon technology transfer has been going on for a quite long time. The only difference now that we are talking about high technology weapon system. And I will take the end of the presentation from my colleague Tugrul, because he didn't tell us all the story. When China was not allowed to sell the missile system to Turkey, Turkey tried to acquire the Patriot, but the Obama administration blocked it. So who jumped in? And Russia jumped in, selling to Turkey the most advanced anti-missile defensive system, that is the S-400 Triumph. And now with a missile defensive system made in Russia for a NATO partner, the crisis is there. And you can see with the block of transfer of the F-35 fighter jet to Turkey. So military transfer is going on in the region. Probably, as I mentioned before, we are looking at a change in the security architecture, and there will be an increase in arms race. And this arms race will not only increase in conventional weapon system, but also in cyber weapon system. And that's it from my side.
Thank you, Alex. And I wonder how that will contribute to the 5-point plan, that point on collective security that was listed in that 5-point plan. So we will take one more question before we conclude. I see a hand in the audience. Farks, I think, if I pronounced it correctly, Philip Farks, I assume, taking a step, but please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, and thanks a lot for this very interesting talk. My question was, I work, sorry, I'll present myself. I work for the French Development Agency. I'm an advisor in the Middle East. And my question is more on the Levant region and the countries that have been affected by conflict or crisis recently. And my question is about Chinese development policy in these countries. So I'm talking about Lebanon, Syria, and to a lesser extent, Iraq. We saw over the last few years that China made a few key announcements on potential development aids in terms of concessional loans, humanitarian aid, and so on to Syria, for example, to Lebanon. The Chinese government announced that it would be involved in the reconstruction of Syria, which is quite a, let's say, critical issue in the region. After the explosion in Beirut, also a lot of heads turned to China, hoping for some kind of financing. And this is in a period where, let's say Western countries are less inclined to provide development aid to Lebanon because of what's happening, and of course, because of the sanctions in Syria. So my questions for the speakers is, what do you make of these announcements from China showing some kind of interest to be involved in the development of these countries, and the fact that these announcements were rarely followed by real, actual investments? I would be really curious to hear you on that. And also bearing in mind that the Chinese also made announcements about investing in ports in the region, such as in Tartus in Syria, but also in the port of Tripoli in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we have everyone giving 1 to 2 minutes to respond to this question? Maybe Tugru, do you want to start first?
I mean, actually, instead of answering, can I share the short video with you guys?
Yeah, if you can.
Directly related with this, not directly, indirectly related with the answer, with investment, Chinese investment and Chinese investment versus the Western investment. It was a very interesting video. It's an old video, but it's short, 1 minute video, if I can show you, actually, if you don't mind.
Please go ahead, 1 minute. Thank you.
1 minute, yeah.
I'm been very concerned lately about China. They're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port.
And what's wrong with that?
And well, because
countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on. I mean, I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So. Let me
give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionist, absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom. The Chinese never asked Apple to go to Shenzhen and produce all the iPhones. It was Steve Jobs that decided that. Yeah? Mm-hmm. It was not China that went to Washington, D.C. and demanded that they buy a third of your national debt. If they hadn't bought it, you would be in serious trouble. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions. Instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure. We would like to build some new airports, upgrade your railway system, create a telephone system, and rebuild your roads. And we'll do this all for free. No strings attached. We don't want anything from you. And they did. Why did they do it? Because it's soft power. They are immensely self-serving.
I mean, exactly. This is like soft power. You know, the humanitarian approach and humanitarian investment in the region is like a soft power. You know, we will see how China will use this soft power in the region. Chinese relationship will be developed under these circumstances, from my perspective, I think. Soft power, China's soft power is very important in the region, not just the trade, not just the economy. So.
Thanks, Tugru. Guy, do you want to follow up from there?
Thank you. Yeah. So it's always a tough ask to follow Yanis Varoufakis, isn't it? But anyway, I will try. No, just to, I mean, the question that was asked about sort of, you know, China's involvement in places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. I mean, the main point I would make is that actually, if you look at the figures, there's relatively low Chinese investment in compared to other parts of the Middle East, you know, specifically around the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran, and Israel, and then also Israel. And I think part of the reason for that is, you know, it is these countries are, you know, in conflicts. They are therefore not attractive business investments. They're not attractive to sink risk. You know, ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, Chuchu's alluded to the Belt and Road being sort of a broad idea, you know, which didn't have a lot of content. The content had to be filled by companies. And okay, yes, we can talk about state companies primarily in terms of the infrastructure sector, but also private companies. For them, it's not in their interest to invest in a place where there is risk. And so conflict has to be sorted out. So this is one of actually the challenges associated with the development through peace paradigm, because, you know, what we're getting is this idea that maybe we can solve the problems of conflict through development, right? You know, let's park to one side democracy and all of that, but let's focus on a developmentalist approach. The problem is that the bulk of Chinese financing and funding and projects are going to the most developed parts of the Middle East.
Thank you, Guy. 1 minute from Chuchu and Alex, I'm afraid. Chuchu, please.
Okay, thank you. I'll make it briefly in just 2 points. So the first one is that just as what Guy has mentioned, actually China's investment in like the Levant or Syria and Lebanon is less than its investment in other parts of the region. And it's not just less than the investment in Gulf countries or Israel, but it's also less than in North Africa. And actually one important reason is the risks is high and the places are in conflict. But another important reason is that those places are quite sensitive. On the one hand, both Russia and the United States have their own interests in the region, and any kind of action from China can raise controversies and problems. And also China has, just as Frog has mentioned, actually China has been encountering a lot of criticism and debates when it comes to the aid issue in the region. It can be sensitive since it's in conflict. And my second point is that actually, when you talk about the investment of China, you will have to bear in mind that actually in recent years, China's investment is declining, not only in the Middle East, and not only in different parts of the Middle East, but also in the other parts of the world. And that is because China's own economic growth has slowed down. And on the one hand, since the Belt and Road Initiative has now evolved into a broad initiative that includes every country in the world, so it means that China's investment has to be distracted from different countries. So it's like impossible for it to maintain a large sum of investment in each part. And the second more important problem is that China's own economic growth is slowing down, particularly in this COVID-19 pandemic. So that is why its investment capacity is slowing down. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuchu, Guy, and Tugru. Sorry, there was some problems with unmuting earlier. Alex, do you want to have the last word?
Definitely, I was trying to have it early, but I see that our IT people prefer to don't let me do it, and I think they are right. I will be brief. First and foremost, if we look at the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi regime in Libya, was an eye-opener for China that have to evacuate 36,000 or more Chinese workers almost overnight. And it was a lesson that was telling to China that throwing money at the problem, especially a security problem, was not the solution. And my second point is basically looking at the question, but not from a Chinese perspective, but from a Levant perspective, and even in the Middle East, that most of the time there are over expectation about Chinese investment. Like something is going to happen, or it happened in Syria for the reconstruction, and the Chinese are just stepping in, throwing money everywhere and rebuilding the country. So this over expectation, especially in the Levant, can create a problem in the long term. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was very brief. So we have now come to the end of today's MEI event on China and the Middle East. My sincere gratitude to all our 4 speakers to join us today and take time off your busy schedule and to give us your insights. So a big thank you to our audience as well for your questions. We have an event on Thursday at the same time, 4 p.m. Singapore time, a webinar which will cover and assess Israel's expanding Arab relations. So please do join us then.